In this episode of Monday Moments, we're talking about how to have compassion for broken people, so stick around and stay tuned. Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Monday Moments, aka Bald, Bearded, and Biblical. My name is Travis Keys, I'm your host, and with me today is Pastor James Gallagher. Thanks for being with us today again.
Happy to be here.
We are continuing our sermon series in compassion, and this is part 2 of compassion. If you haven't had a chance to watch or listen to this past Sunday sermon, you can do so right here on our YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's jump into it.
Let's go.
So, once again, I thought it was a great sermon on compassion, and I loved, in particular, the distinction that you're making between, I think, sympathy and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you've been distinguishing those two is that compassion should produce us or produce something, some kind of action, whereas sympathy is just a general, oh, I feel sorry or I feel bad for that person, but I don't actually do anything for them. So I wondered if you might, for people who are watching or listening, maybe just give a quick recap and maybe what kind of the big idea of your sermon from this past Sunday was.
Yeah, so we talked last week about the Father, and so we covered the prodigal son and talked about how Jesus would oftentimes use these parables, or he would use a statement like the kingdom of heaven is like, and he would use these things to try to describe whether it was the kingdom of heaven, whether it was the Father, these different things. And so yesterday we talked about what does compassion look like through the life of Jesus. And so we looked specifically at the story of Jesus right after the passing of John the Baptist, when he was killed by Herod. And when Jesus was still obviously very much in that place of grief over that, how he shifted from that place to show compassion to the people. And we talked a lot about what is required in order to have compassion. And that passage there in Matthew 14, in verse 14, it says that he saw. And we took some time to discuss, like, that word saw is not, it's not a, he saw the physical evidence of a person. It's that he saw the spiritual condition. Like it means something much greater than just to see with physical eyes. There was a spiritual looking within, and it resulted in him. It resulted in a feeling within him that produced compassion. And that compassion always. You said a minute ago, that compassion should do this. If it doesn't lead to an action, it's not compassion. Wow. Like it has to have an action connected to it if it's going to be compassion. Yeah, that's good.
Why do you think we so often fail to see past the outward condition of people? Or maybe in other words, like we're just looking with our physical eyes. We don't see with that spiritual sight.
Yeah. I mean, simple answer, I think a lot of times we don't want to. I think that because we can, if we just look at the external part of something, we may look at it and it's like, well, there's not anything I can do to fix that. Well, what if what needs to be fixed is not so significantly tied to the external as to what's going on in the internal? And we really do have to, we've got to force ourselves to be willing to look beyond that, to ask the harder questions. What kind of pain would produce this in a person? And because I think that if we see that, then all of a sudden, it's not that we're obligated to do something about it, but there is a responsibility to do something with it. And then that's kind of leaves us in this position of saying, am I going to help or am I not? It's obvious now that I see their pain. Like I know that I should help.
Right.
But that's like it leaves you at a critical decision point of saying, am I going to do this or not?
Yeah. We've got this juncture that we've got to make that decision. Ideally, I think it would be once we are able to see people the way that the Lord sees people, it should produce this desire within us to
Yeah.
want to help. I mean, that's the ideal situation. But at the same time, because we are still partly flesh, we do have to wrestle against that. Am I going to get out of my comfort zone or whatever the case and context might be and actually help these people or help this person, this neighbor, this whatever?
Yeah, and I think that's why, one of the things that I've said a number of times is that compassion always represents a turning point.
Right.
And so even for us, like if we're going to have compassion, it is likely going to interrupt whatever is right in front of me.
Right.
It's going to interrupt my life. It's probably going to interrupt maybe my family's life. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways that it could go, but there's a turning point. Like all of a sudden now I am having to make a decision as to whether or not I'm going to allow my life to be interrupted,
right,
to come alongside this person and really begin to see how is my response going to fit into what I can see.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something that you and I had talked about a long time ago. I mean, when I first became a youth leader many, many moons ago, you and I were talking about the woman who was caught in adultery. And that was the first time you kind of illustrated what does kind of this relational ministry look like practically. And, the story, if you're not familiar, is this woman's caught in the act of adultery, and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of that time, bring her to Jesus and say, the law says, it demands that we should stone her. What do you say we do? And they were trying to trap Jesus.
Yeah.
And Jesus got down in the dirt and wrote something in the dirt with his finger and then got back up. And the famous words that most people have heard before is, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And the thing that I thought was interesting that you said was, people argue and question, well, what did Jesus write? Yeah. And you said, I don't think it really matters. Yeah. I think what matters more is that he got down on her level and he met her need of aloneness before saying, now go and sin no more. Yeah. There was a need that she had that needed to be met first. And he was able to look past that outward sin. It didn't condone it, didn't excuse it. He did address it and say, now go and sin no more. But he met that need first. And I think that challenges us when we see something that is offensive or uncomfortable, or even like you said, it seems overwhelmingly beyond our capacity to help or do something about it. We've got to make that decision that says, am I going to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this situation?
Yeah, and that's when you study the word compassion, the Latin root of that is it essentially means to join in misery.
Wow.
And that doesn't mean that I become miserable, but it means that I enter into their misery with them. And when you look at that with what Jesus did, let's just say with the woman caught in adultery, what did he do? He didn't leave her alone in her misery. And obviously, I mean, you play that story out, she was dressed inappropriately, if dressed at all, at that point, surrounded by men, shame, them yelling, condemning her to death, all of these different things. And Jesus joined her in her misery at that point. And when everyone else had left, he sends her on her way and says, I'm not going to condemn you. Go and sin no more. And I think that there's this part. I think one of the things that keeps us from showing compassion is that we feel like if we show compassion at times to people that are very obviously in a miserable place because of what they've done, I've heard people say before, I don't want to condone. Compassion doesn't have anything to do with condoning someone's behavior. And yet there's this fear that says if I show compassion to this person, they'll think that I condone their behavior. Look, if someone is in misery because of their behavior, they're probably pretty aware that their behavior got them there.
Yeah.
So they don't need a lecture on their behavior.
Yeah.
What they need is someone who's willing to come alongside them
Yeah.
in that place. And that's really what compassion does.
Yeah. Well, and I may be showing my age now, but John David, our worship director, played that. Now it's old Hillsong United song, Mighty to Save, right? What's the opening line? Everybody needs compassion.
Everybody need compassion.
Yeah. And I love that. I mean, I love that song because I kind of grew up with it, but but I love that. And it's such a good reminder for all of us that we were at one time that lost sheep. That Christ had compassion for and pursued and went after and redeemed.
Yeah, and that's what's, I think that's what's beautiful. Matthew and Mark both record that Jesus' compassion was because what he saw was that they were sheep without a shepherd.
Right.
Like they were lost. They were in misery. They had no hope. There was no one there to protect them, to lead them, to guide them, to watch over them. And it moved Jesus, not just, again, it wasn't this intellectual decision.
Right.
It was this very emotional connection that he had to these people that were hurting and in misery.
Yeah, and I think without seeing the way that Jesus saw people who are lost, and that's what Jesus said he came to do. I came to seek and save that which is lost. Yeah. And so, hold on, I think I feel a tweetable moment coming on.
Uh-oh.
Without great compassion, there can be no great commission. Ooh, see what I did there? Yep. Okay,
someone capture it now.
All right, moving on. And as you were talking, one of the verses that came to my mind is 1 Peter in chapter 1 in verses 5 through 9. It says, "In view of all this, make every effort to respond to God's promises. Supplement or add to your faith a generous provision of moral excellence. With moral excellence, add knowledge, and with knowledge, add self-control. With self-control, add patient endurance with godliness." And then this is what I think is interesting, starting in verse 7. It says, "And with godliness, add brotherly affection, and then with brotherly affection, add a love for everyone." And so Peter, as he's writing this, is saying, start with yourself. Start with moral excellence, right? And then knowledge, self-control, patient endurance, et cetera, et cetera. But then don't forget to add to your faith brotherly love for Christians, love for other Christians. And then don't forget to add love for everyone. And then, this final verse 9 says, "But those who fail to develop in this way," I'm sorry, I missed a verse. Let me back up. Verse 8 says, "The more you grow like this, the more productive and useful you will be in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But those who fail," this is verse 9, "but those who fail to develop in this way are short-sighted or blind, forgetting that they have been cleansed from their old sins."
Yeah.
And it's kind of this, for me anyways, simultaneously like encouraging, like roadmap, do this, and you'll be productive.
Yeah.
But then also kind of this warning of, if you fail to develop in this way, you're short-sighted or blind, and you've forgotten that you've been cleansed from your old sin. And I wonder if, I was thinking about this and thinking, I wonder if that's another reason why we so often fail to look past people's outward condition, is that we kind of get caught up in this adding to ourselves, all the moral excellence, the knowledge, and those things, but we stop before we get to love for other people, love for everyone. Or, we have forgotten that we have been cleansed from our sins, that we were the ones who are in need of compassion. And it made me think of, if I went and planted an apple tree, and somehow, in this hypothetical scenario, I was able to say, okay, you've grown, you've got leaves, but stop right there. Yeah. And it didn't produce any fruit. It didn't do what it was intended to do, which was to produce fruit. And I think that's where that compassion comes in, is that it's meant for us to produce and be fruitful. And that's kind of what I was thinking of when I was reading this section of verses out of 1 Peter.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so Jesus was posed with the question, "Who is my brother?" And he ended up answering it in a way that became very uncomfortable for all of the people that were there. He essentially he brings in all of the, like, we have a responsibility to people.
Yeah.
And that word short-sighted, I mean, I think it applies very well here, because to say that it's short-sighted, it means that, like, I can't see beyond your physical condition.
Wow.
And to see beyond that is to really see the nature of the person and the condition of the person. But I see that a lot in our society. I mean, I see the things that we choose to wrestle over, the things that we choose to war over with people, and essentially the only thing that we end up seeing is this earthly kingdom, and we think that if we can manipulate this earthly kingdom enough, if we can bring it into submission, whether that be, and again, I think that we have a responsibility to the earthly king, like to influence into all of these different things. But I think that what's short-sighted is that we spend all of our time focused on the earthly kingdom, thinking that we're going to have this tremendous impact on it. And I think that the short-sightedness is like, if we would really focus on the eternal kingdom, it will have significant impacts on the earthly kingdom.
Right.
And yet when we're always talking about how do I fix the earthly kingdom? How do I do these things? The Bible's pretty clear. Our warring is not with flesh and blood. That's not just the physical representation of a person. That is what we can see with our eyes. Our battle is not against these things, but it is against the principalities and the powers of darkness, the rulers of this world. So where should that battle be fought? And that's, I think, when we begin to see into those places, what it does is it begins to also help us see beyond just the physical embodiments of people, and really begin to get into it and go, wait a second, this person is lost, and what feels like them warring against me is really this much more significant battle that we're not seeing. This person needs Jesus,
right?
And the way that Jesus oftentimes gained an audience with those types of people was through compassion.
Yeah.
And it opened a door to the spiritual kingdom for them. So
that's good. Yeah, I think it was Tim Mackey who kind of maybe coined the phrase or came up with it. Jesus' upside down kingdom. It was just a different way than what we are used to and what we expected.
Yeah.
I know we're just about out of time. In kind of wrapping up, if someone's we're watching this and listening to this and saying, I really need to start showing more compassion. I need to be more compassionate. See past just the outward appearance.
Yeah.
How do I do that? How would you encourage someone?
Yeah, I think that it begins on our knees before the Lord, and just really asking the Lord, would you open my eyes? I think that first to really allow Him to open our eyes to our own brokenness. I think that one of the things that makes it difficult at times for us is that we consider ourselves many times less in need of the grace and the mercy and the compassion that God showed me.
Yeah.
We look at someone like, well, they're really lost.
Yeah.
Well, lost is lost. I mean,
Lost
there's
is lost.
no, and we want to give like varying degrees. We grade sin.
Right.
We're like, well, that's a really bad sin. Well, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Anything short of the glory of God was in need of redemption.
Right.
And it was in need of the same redemption that everybody else needed.
Yeah.
And so I think that first to recognize that we too were in need of that compassion. And it might have looked different. Our life, our circumstances, our situation may have looked different, but we were just as in need of that compassion. And then to really begin to ask the Lord, would you open my eyes? When I encounter difficult people, I have found that one way that I have done this is to ask one very simple question. What is hurting in this person?
Yeah.
What I am seeing may be anger, it may be resentment, it may be all of these different things. That may be the evident part of it. And I may look at it and say, you know what, they're just not a nice person. But if I will take a step back and just ask myself, what underneath all of this, what is hurting?
Yeah.
I tell you, if you can begin to see someone's pain, it changes the way you respond.
Yeah.
Because now there's a part of you that's being moved. You're not just resistant to the rough external. Like there's something within you that hurts with them. And that can either be sympathy, it can be pity,
Sure,
or you can allow it to become compassion.
Yeah.
By doing something, by turning directions and going towards that. So
that's good. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to kind of dive into this a little bit more. And thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Monday Moments. We hope that you've enjoyed this content. And if you have, please give us a thumbs up or comment. Let us know what you think, if something stood out to you. We love to hear feedback from you. We love to know that this is encouraging you, helping you grow in your relationship with God and others. So let us know. Reach out to us. So thank you so much again for joining us for another episode of Monday Moments, and we will see you next week.